Hello, everybody. Welcome. This time in English. We'll hold this seminar in English because we have a non-Polish speaking presenter here today. We're going to have a very interesting presentations. Please welcome online our guests, Mr. Borys Cieślak and Paula Nagler. I spell your name correctly. Mr. Cieślak is working in Gran Sasso Science Institute in Italy. Dr. Nagler is from Rotterdam, from Erasmus University, and they're going to have a presentation today consuming their study on which is called Regional Capital No More. How the reform of the territorial government has marginalized Polish middle-sized cities. I understand that this is in part a reaction to an earlier study by Dr. Kurniewicz, who had the presentation for us last semester, and we are eager and very interested in see how differently approach the subject and what are the results. So the floor is yours. I remind you that you have 45 minutes for your presentation. After that, we'll collect questions from both people here in the auditorium and people who joined us online. And then you have time to respond to these questions. So the floor is yours. Please welcome.
Okay. Just first a technicality. Can you hear me well, and can you see the title slide?
Yes, we do.
Perfect. So, well, first of all, thank you very much for this warm introduction. And thank you for the opportunity to present our research here today in front of the EuroReg community. And I have to say it is as exciting as it is stressful, because it's the first time we are showing this study to a Polish audience. So your feedback will be extremely valuable for us. And well, what you're gonna see in the next 40 minutes or so is the outcome of a joint effort of Dr. Paula Nagler from the Erasmus University, Professor Frank van Oort, also from the Erasmus University. He couldn't make it today. Hopefully he'll join as a listener a bit later. And also an outcome of my modest contribution, and I'm a PhD candidate in economic geography at the Gran Sasso Science Institute. So this history of this study dates back actually to 2020, 2021. So it coincides in publication date, so to speak, with Dr. Kurniewicz's study, because in 2021, it was published as my master thesis. And then Paula and Frank have joined me to further develop this study, make it a bit more complex. And only 2 years and 70 versions later, it was published as a discussion paper by Tinbergen Institute. Now we are still working on it, modifying it here and there. And we have submitted it to the regional studies and are awaiting the review. So we're curious what the reviewers will make of it, and we're curious what you will make of it. So that's for the history. And now let's move to the presentation, plan of which is very simple. I'd like to start with giving you a bit of a background of the 1998 reform and the research design and the methods we have used to try to assess its impact on the affected cities. And then I'll pass the floor to Paula, who will share our findings and conclusions. But as the first thing which I would like to do is to do a very, very brief summary, because maybe someone has, well, a shorter attention span, or maybe it's not as excited as we are about territorial reforms and econometric models. But to cut the long story short, back when I was designing my master thesis, I kept asking myself the question whether this reform and removing the seats of regional governments from the middle-sized cities affected their development negatively. And back in the day, no one used difference in difference models to check it. And difference in differences are, a staple in policy impact assessment. So I thought, why not do it? And, well, I think that you can pretty convincingly, using this identification strategy, show how the impact was, well, real and negative. And so that's the short story. And now let's move to the longer one. And I think the best way to start it is with a bit of the history of the 1998 reform. So as you all probably perfectly know, but maybe there are some listeners online who are not from Poland. In 1989, Poland has kickstarted this transition from socialism to capitalist democracy. And this required an overhaul or revival of territorial governments across different layers. And the first one to be reestablished were our municipalities, local governments. And this is allegedly one of the most successful reforms of the entire transition. Yet, to decide upon the shape of regional division and the county layer turned out to be way more problematic, and it took 8 more years, fierce debates how to go about it. And the number of voivodeships kept changing until the very last moment when the then president Aleksander Kwaśniewski has almost manually increased their number to 16. So the reform was passed in 1998 and implemented 1 year later. And here I'd like to also make use of this timeline and hint our data collection or the time frame for our data collection. So to make sense of this reform, we have to have some pre-treatment period, so sometime before the reform, and data about what happened afterwards. So we went as far back in time as Statistics Poland allowed us to do it. So 1995, when they started collecting indicators of interest for us. And then we collected 20 years worth of data after the reform. Here you have a glimpse of the situation before and after the reform. So you can appreciate that we have greatly reduced the number of voivodeships, and they are, much bigger now. And I think the sensible question to ask, why bother? Why go along the way to totally overhaul our regional division? Why couldn't we have left it the way it was before? And there were 2, sets of arguments, some in favor and some against this reform. So those who were in favor were arguing that we need to further our devolutionary efforts. And because the public service provision was still too much leaning on the central government, we need to, go on with devolution and then implement the county layer. There were also claims about improving public sector efficiency. So the fewer regions would mean smaller public sector and hopefully a more efficient one. Then some people were arguing that we shouldn't spread our investment efforts thin, that we should concentrate our investments in the biggest of the cities because they're the only ones which have any sensible chance in international competition. And other places will benefit through a spatial trickle-down mechanism from their growth. And last but not least, as we were eyeing accession to the European Union, there was a conviction that we should make our regions or voivodeships comparable in size to their Western European counterparts. On the other hand, academics and politicians under the leadership of then Marshal of the Senate, Adam Struzik, were non-convinced by this type of argumentation, and they produced pretty interesting book in which they outlined all their worries. And first of all, they argued that changing the regional structure the way it was changed would lead to increased polarization, so uneven development, and it will destroy the social structures which have emerged around the former regional capitals. So with the benefit of the hindsight, those counter arguments may seem reasonable, but they were not that convincing back in the day. So the reform went through, and we have reduced the number of voivodeships to 16. Another important question I think one should ask him or herself when thinking about this reform was how were the regions delimited? And from what I could recollect from the literature and from the debates, there was little talk about how to really go about designing the regions. It was more about choosing the city that should perform the regional capital role and then to delimit the voivodeship accordingly. So to speak roughly, the main preoccupation was the choice of the cities. And this, I think, remains a non-trivial question also for us. So what happened as a result of the reform? The entire population of former regional capitals, 49 cities, was divided in 2 groups. 31 cities which have lost their capital status and 18 cities to which pretty much nothing happened, a apart from becoming, as the other cities, the seats of county governments. And this happens to be convincingly and conveniently for us, so-called quasi-experimental, natural experimental situation, in which one group can be seen as a control group, to which nothing interesting happens, and the other is the so-called treatment group, and we're interested in understanding the impact of the treatment. And you can go, you can use many different estimation methods to try to understand it. The one we use is difference in differences, but regardless of the methods, there are many assumptions and many caveats that has to be met. And one of the most important caveats is the random assignment to the treatment and control group. And it seems a bold question because now we are kind of asking whether it was random or as good as random, or whether the assignment to one of the groups was good, was random. And to put otherwise, and please bear with me because it's not super intuitive, it should be random from the perspective of the outcome of our interest. So as we are interested in the development trajectories of the cities, ideally, their development trajectories before the reform should not be deriving their assignment to one or the other group. So to put simply, we have to understand what were the determinants of choosing which cities will remain regional capitals. And luckily, literature is really, it's unclear in this regard. Gilowska and colleagues whom I have already referred to, they were claiming it was the size of the city, obviously. So only the biggest cities have the metropolitan functions, the international prowess, and the ability or human capital needed to manage regional development. So the size of the cities was the main driver. Zaborowski, in turn, in his PhD thesis, claims that there were no criteria which were used consistently that could explain assignment of those cities to different groups. And then Majchrowski further complicates the picture by saying it was the political bargaining and the links with the then president, SLD party, that played a non-trivial role in deciding who will or who will not be regional capital. And this happens to be our first research question. And actually, it's an important question because we have to answer this first to be able to go on with the difference and differences. So we asked, did the size and economic features and political alignment of the city before the reform increase the probability of remaining a regional capital? The second question is about the consequences of the reform, and to make sense of them, we have to appreciate the wider context of Polish middle-sized cities and their condition, which, according mainly to Professor Śleszyński, is rather bleak. He claims that our polycentric settlement structure is becoming more and more uneven, that small and medium-sized cities face a lot of economic, demographic, and financial problems, and overall misery. I don't think that the situation is that bad, yet that's the image you get from the literature. And what's even more important than the absolute state of our middle-sized cities is how they fare compared to the biggest agglomerations. And there is a sort of conviction that we see an improvement in the quality of life in the biggest agglomerations, but the middle-sized cities are not doing that well. So there's a growing discrepancy between them. And we would like to find out whether the reform has contributed to this growing discrepancy. And as I hinted already in the beginning, well, we're not the first one asking this question. It's a pretty popular one in Polish regional studies. And one of the inquiries by Dr. Krysiński is, I think, pretty interesting. He asked people of Kalisz, dwellers of Kalisz, the former regional capital, what do they make of the reform? And they're obviously very unhappy. And they blame the reform for many issues Kalisz is currently facing. But then Kurniewicz and Swaniewicz in 2016 wisely asked whether it's a phantom pain or a real loss. And nowadays, I think Dr. Kurniewicz, who also happens to use diff and diff, is leaning more towards phantom pain, while we are leaning more towards a real loss. There were also other studies in this vein, but most of them have used only post-treatment data or descriptive statistics. And because of this, they make attributing the differences in development between current and former regional capitals to the reform problematic. And hence our second research question. So to what extent did the reform contribute to the growing disparities between these two groups of cities And let me briefly tell you how we went about answering this. So the first question concerned with understanding the determinants of remaining regional capital. We tried to answer this using probit models with different specifications. Here we will report the probit models using data from 1 year before the reform. And we looked into the variables identified in the political debates and the variables which seemed reasonable, which could have affected the probability to maintaining the status. So the population, economic factors, and political alignment understood as the membership of the city councillors and the mayors in the SLD party. The second question, well, we made use of this convenient quasi-experimental situation and the panel data we have. And we've run many different regressions with time and unit fixed effects. And the important thing about this type of estimation strategy is the parallel trends assumption. So to make any sensible inference based on this method, we have to make sure that the groups, the treatment and control group, which can be systematically different before the treatment, are following parallel trends. So they have to be going kind of the same way before the reform. And after the reform, if we observe any divergence in the trends, we can attribute this divergence in slopes trends to the treatment. And we have run our models for 5, 10, and 20 years periods after the reform to try to see whether the magnitude of impact has changed. And we always control for population or the city size to take stock of agglomeration effects and also of the outcome for a probit model, about which Paula will tell you more in a second. And before I give the floor to her, there's one more important thing I have to still clarify. It is how do we conceptualize socioeconomic development trajectories? So what it is that we really measure. And as you can possibly imagine, there's a multitude of channels or multitude of ways in which losing a big chunk of public sector and losing a position in an administrative hierarchy can influence socioeconomic development of the city. Here, I will limit our discussion to the most often cited ones. So first of all, if the public sector is becoming smaller in the given city, its demand most probably will also become smaller. So it's a sort of a direct hit to the local economy. And then comes loss of prestige, which can influence a city in many ways. And interestingly, I think exclusion from the networks of political power and decision-making. So imagine you're a mayor of a city or a civil servant and you share a building with the regional government and you go for lunch with the people from the regional government. So you can ask them for a favor, you can get some new information. Anyway, you're linked. But once this regional government moves away, you can have this connection no more, or it's not so convenient, it's not so easy. So that's the third type of argument. The fourth one was more about the locational preferences of private companies. So there's a conviction in the literature that especially in the volatile times, like Poland in the 90s, firms would tend to locate in the capital cities to have access to politicians and public servants to be better informed about the ever-changing legislation. So to take stock of all those possible channels of influence and to go beyond the usual, economistic conceptualization of local development, we try to look at it broadly. So we have devised 4 dimensions of socioeconomic development: economic, physical, demographic, and cultural. And as you can see, we didn't go really far away from the economistic way of thinking, because we could go only as far as Goose statistics Paula would allow us to. So in those 4 dimensions, we have looked into 18 indicators, in each of the indicators separately. So for the economic aspects, we have looked into the influence of the reform on the supply of housing, number of public entities, number of private firms, and we also disentangle this into different sectors. Share of working population. For the fiscal dimension, it's the most problematic one. I have to admit, it's the weakest, I think, part of our study for a number of reasons. But yet we have tried to see whether there was any impact on the levels of general subsidy and own revenues raised by our municipalities and asset-related investment of the local government. In the demographic dimension, well, we looked into population and migration rates, which, as you probably know, are problematic because of the way Goose statistics Poland is estimating them. But we also checked the share of children and checked the share of seniors in the population. And those two variables proved to be, well, more informative. And then for the cultural amenities, we used the data of cinemas, libraries, and museums to see whether there was, well, any impact, because also those institutions tend to locate in the capital cities. So that's everything from my side. And I can now pass the floor to Paula. And Paula, do you want to share your screen, or should I change the slides for you?
Yeah, thank you, Borys. I'm just looking here. There's an option above to request remote control. I'm trying this. If this doesn't work, then I actually prefer that you continue being
Okay.
the screener. See?
Yeah, it should work.
Okay. I'm trying to change the slides. Yeah. Okay, it works. Yeah. Just have to go back again. Seems to be a small time lag. Okay, good. Then after these technicalities, I also want to check that you can hear me well. Is this the case and see me? Seems so. Okay, good. Thank you very much. Then thanks to Borys for the first part and introduction. And also again, from my side, thank you very much for this invitation. So I'm probably one of the few non-Polish speakers today. And I've actually seen in the meantime that also Frank is joining us as an attendee in the seminar. So I will continue with the findings. And the first one relates to research question 1, so the treatment assignments, the probability of losing or maintaining the regional capital status. So here, as Borys already mentioned, we are on a different specification, and specifically like these 5 that you can see. What did we include in the specifications? So the variables identified in the previous literatures are related to city size, to economic base, and to the political alignment. Then we also looked into variables that were significantly different between both groups. And then finally, also just variables that are sensible to consider. Like just to give you an example, library visitors will unlikely drive such a treatment. And what we have seen while running this regression is that depending on a specification, some of the variables are significant or not, but the significance often changes depending on the specification. But what we see throughout all those 5 specifications is that population size matters. So what does it mean? So treatment is coded as 1. So if a city was treated, meaning that it lost its regional capital status, indeed, this is associated with a lower population size in these cities. And you can see that it varies between minus 0.28 to minus 0.61. So we definitely have here a clear negative effect, meaning that smaller cities were more likely to lose its capital city status. What we do not see is that the economic base really matters. So for example, when you look at private firms or firms in a specific sector, so yes, they can be significant in some specifications, but not in others. And also this political alignment, as mentioned by Borys. Oh, 1 second, it's just jumped. So the political alignment, as you can see in regression 4 and 5, is not significantly related to treatment. Because city size is significant in all regressions, we will hold this factor constant in all our other regressions when we now come to research question number 2. So research question number 2 is the actual impact of the loss of regional capital status. We divided this in these different dimensions. So we start with the economic dimension, and we ran these regressions for 5, 10, and 20 years. You can see here as control, we have LN population. And we report the parallel trends assumption, if it's significant or not, and the number of observations. So what we can see here, like are, well, a couple of things. First of all, that with the exception of public entities, all variables that capture the economic dimension are significant. And not only that, but that the impact increases over time. So if you look at the coefficient size 5, 10, and 20 years, you see after each time period, they increase in magnitude. The second thing is what you see is that the parallel trends assumption is met. So we reject the assumption that they systematically differ, and you can see they're all above the critical threshold. So here actually we can see that indeed we are pretty convinced that the loss of capital city status translated into less buildings, like less new buildings, less area for new buildings, less private firms, and a reduction in working population. If we look specifically at private firms, which is an interesting measurement of economic development, we can also see when we compare the actual like levels of this indicator that the reform explains approximately half of the discrepancy in 2019. So it's not that both groups were exactly the same before, so they differed already before. They were, however, moving parallel to each other, but due to the reform, the divergence increased further, so that half of the current divergence, so in 2019, can be explained by this reform. This is then also the visualization of these different trends. I have to explain here that what you see, like when it starts in 1995, the data collection is not the actual level, but this specific graphs start at the same point, no matter how much they diverged before. And the reason is that you can then better see if the parallel trend assumption is met. And if you look here at these 5 different indicators, indeed, like if you look at these years to the left of the treatment year, you see that they almost overlap in all 5 cases. And you also see then afterwards that the divergence starts. Yeah, if you look again at the private sector firms, so the control group is the one that maintained the status, the treatment group, the one that lost it. You see before the treatment year, the line like almost completely overlaps. And shortly afterwards, the control group, so those that maintain the regional capital status, increases more than the cities that were treated, although both rise, the ones that maintain the capital city status rise more, and you see an increasing divergent trend, also what you see in the regression output. With regard to the economic dimension, we also looked more closely into different sectors. We chose 8 different sectors, like from manufacturing, construction to education and healthcare. What we see here is that it was not like one particular sector affected, so the influence seems to be pretty dispersed. Not all sectors were affected. So if you look, for example, into a wholesale, retail, or transport and tourism, there we do not see a significant effect. And we also see, when you look into the construction sector and finance and high-skilled services, that there the parallel trends assumption are not made. So there we cannot really say something about the impact of this reform, because both groups already diverged before the treatment. What we can see is that there's a negative impact in manufacturing, in education, and in healthcare. There is a parallel trend assumption before the treatment, and the magnitude again over time increased. What is also important to say here is that we only report for 5 and 10 years, because after, I don't remember, I think 2009, the way these different sectors were calculated, it changed, and it would be too complicated to match this with this new definitions of these sectors. So we decided not to report for 20 years because simply it would not be comparable. So what I can also still say about this is that education and healthcare, which were negatively impacted, these are that we consider foundational sectors. As I mentioned, wholesale, transport and tourism are unaffected. And indeed, maybe there, if you think about it, so for example, tourism, like tourists may not care so much if this is indeed a regional capital or not. And wholesales and retails is also a sector that relies a lot on, well, space. So for example, warehouses. So indeed, there you could also imagine that being in a smaller place with plenty of space to have such warehouses would actually benefit. And even though it's not significant, for example, in wholesale retail, you see that the coefficient is positive. We then move to the fiscal dimension, and Borys already mentioned while he was presenting that this is a bit of a difficult dimension. The reason is that there were a lot of changes in these years following the treatment. So, simultaneous changes in public finance. And what we see and what makes it problematic is that with the exception of investment, which in turn is not significant, the parallel trend assumption is not met. So we do see the significance of these different indicators. We see the direction of them, but we cannot really attribute those discrepancies to reforms. What is interesting is that the own revenues of cities has a negative sign. The investment share as well, and the subsidy is positive, and this is indeed as expected because those cities that were treated were promised higher subsidies to compensate for the loss in capital city status, and this is indeed what we also see. However, as I just mentioned, we cannot attribute the discrepancies to the reform. So there's actually very little we can say about the fiscal dimension. Here you can also see the visualization of these four indicators. And here you can also see that before the treatment year, so before 1998, indeed the parallel trends are not met. And you see that those two lines of the control and the treatment group are not overlapping. I then move to the demographic dimension. Here we have four different indicators from the population size, where we it's the only one where we do not have a control, of course. The net migration, children and seniors. We see here a negative effect on the population size. However, the parallel trends assumption is not met. We do not see a significant effect on net migration, but Borys already mentioned that this might be a bit misleading because people who move within Poland do not always register in their new address. So they might still be registered where they used to live. What is then a bit more indicative is the share of children and seniors. And there, the parallel trends assumption is met. And we see that indeed the share of children declines over time. And again, in an accelerating fashion. So this impact increases over time. And seniors, initially, there's no significant effect after 5 or 10 years, but then after 20 years, indeed, we see a higher share of seniors. So what does it mean? So what we assume it happens is that the working population moves out of the city, moves to other places, old people stay behind, and these younger working population take the children with them. And also then there are less middle-aged people, or let's say people in reproductive age that then have children in these cities. So this results and suggests an increasing age dependency ratio. Here then the visualization of these different indicators. What is quite interesting is that population actually diverged. As you can see that there was the parallel trend assumption was not met. And before 1998, actually those cities that were treated later, so that lost the regional capital status, they were growing faster compared to the ones that maintained it. But in the year approximately 2002, this trend diverged and the population declined. So it declined in both groups, but it declined much faster in those cities that lost the regional capital status. Net migration, you see again that there is no parallel trend before the treatment. And yeah, then you also see that at some point the treatment group had more net migration than control, and then it reversed at some point. And very nice to see is the share of children and seniors, parallel trends before the treatment here, and then a diverging trend afterwards, and the trend increases over time. Then I move to the final dimension that we looked at, which is the cultural dimension. And here the 4 indicators: cinema visits, libraries, the number of libraries, the number of library users, and museums. And we see here that cinema visitors and the number of libraries are significantly negatively affected. And with these 2 variables, the parallel trend assumption is met. Library users shows a negative and significant sign. However, we do not have a parallel trend here. And finally, museums, there we have a parallel trend, but they do not seem to be significantly affected, even though the coefficient is negative. So even though here we have a bit of a mixed picture because cinema visits and libraries are significantly negatively affected, we still say that there is some indication that the cultural dimension was negatively affected by this reform. Here is the visualization of these 4 indicators. So here one can see that the control group of in cinema visits is indeed above the one of the treatment. So it diverges right after the year of the treatment. Libraries per 100 inhabitants, the same. So it really declines and increasingly so for the treatment group. Library users, there's like this mixed picture, but again, the treatment group after the year 2002 or 3 declines and at an accelerating pace. And the museums, there is not so much difference. What we then also did after running all this regression is that we did some robustness checks. Unfortunately, it was not so easy because the number of years before the treatment occurred, so the pre-treatment period is not so long, so only 5 years. But what we did were the following. So first of all, we used a placebo treatment group. We used cities with a county status that, however, had not been a regional capital city before as our placebo group. We also checked that they're similar in population size compared to those that were former capital cities and that lost it. So this was our first robustness check. Second, we also ran the models with EU funds with the argument that in regions which are lagging, the European Union allocate more funds, and to see if there any result would differ. And finally, we ran models excluding the 3 biggest cities, also because of this difference in population size between the treated and the control group. And so I'm not going into detail into this robustness checks, but the results were that in principle, like all our results are confirmed, and there was hardly any difference. So for example, when you look at EU funds, yes, EU funds positively affected treated cities, but the difference is not so much, and the results still hold. So all the cities were still negatively affected, and significantly so. Just the coefficient is a little bit different because indeed the EU funds had some positive effects for the cities. Then, after having reported all these findings, I moved to the conclusions. So what we get out of all this analysis is, first of all, indeed, we find a compromised economic potential of the city. So the economic development of the treated cities, so those that lost the regional capital status, indeed was compromised because of this reform. So the difference is not 100% attributed to the reform, but a large share can be attributed to the reform. And in the absence of this reform, we would have expected that these cities fare much better economically. We cannot say anything about the fiscal dimension, but we definitely see some indication that cultural amenities, so the availability and the usage were affected negatively so by the reform. And we see that this reform contributed to the demographic problems of these cities. So an increased age dependency ratio with more seniors in the cities and a lower share of children. The second point is that there was, of course, I think that this is widely discussed in literature, that there's the expectation that these larger cities that maintain the capital city status, this could lead to a spatial trickle-down effect, so that cities may first experience a negative development, but over time, because of the stronger cities, there would be a trickle-down effect. So we don't see that. What we see that in most cases, the negative effect is reinforced over time. So after 5, 10, and 20 years, there's a constant increase in this negative impact with very few exceptions to this. So if there's a spatial trickle-down effect, this is yet to be seen. So far, it's not visible. And the third point, well, is this an argument for deagglomeration? So this could be, because one of the options that we identified, so policy implications, is that one could argue to move certain entities, public entities specifically, from this larger, like from the capital city or from the regional capital cities to this former, to the cities that were former regional capital cities and that lost this title. So this could be one option to consider, so that some of the power of the information and simply also of employment is moved to this former regional capitals. And to finalize, there are a couple of monuments that remember the status of the city, so the regional capital status. And there are various cities that have monuments to this lost title. Here you can see one. Here is yet another one. So it looks really like, let's say, a graveyard, and what Borys also mentioned of this other study that was qualitative. So people are really, emotionally affected by this loss, and they really feel that having lost the status, deeply affected this, and we, with our analysis, can indeed confirm that it has a negative consequence, and increasingly so over time. You get another one, and this is like to summarize. We still then looked at the last aspect to the broad applicability of our study. So what we say is, like going beyond the case of Poland, that with our study we can shed some light on potential consequences of reforming administrative units into larger ones, and the consequences of this loss of this privilege, of the status of this administrative role by cities. And such reforms are indeed common in Europe. Here you can see a whole list of different countries and years where this has happened, like most recently also in France and Norway. So in all these cases, you can also expect that those cities that lost such a status of being a regional capital will indeed have to expect long-term negative consequences that are often also reinforcing over time. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm looking forward now to the discussion.
Thank you very much. It was a very good presentation. I think we are impressed by the clarity and hard work you put in it.
One thing I need to say, I forgot, and this is pretty important, so sorry for interruption, that all the variables we report are normalized. So these are per capita values, per thousand values.
Yeah, thank you for this clarification. An obvious recommendation would be to assign the title of capital to every municipality in Poland. But let's hear what the Territorial has to say about this. I open the floor for discussion. Magda, you will inform me if there are any questions online. Okay.
Okay.
Would like to ask a question? Students first, maybe? No? Professor Smatkowski.
Yes, indeed. Thank you for an interesting presentation and to show us the development process in Poland in last 30 years. Well, I have some doubts, and these doubts relates to different things. The first one is the control group. Well, I know that you control the population, etc., but actually, and based on the research, the development processes in the largest cities in Poland are so much different to those processes that we observe in medium-sized cities that I'm not so surprised that you got the result you obtained. However, I have some doubts whether this could be simply attributed to the loss of status of a capital city. That's probably not the case. And I would be more interested in your information about this robustness check regarding the situation of other middle-sized cities and whether the development process were different than to those processes we observed in the group you analyzed. That's the one thing. The second thing is related to the fact that the city is not a point. It's not in isolation. And this partly also explains some of your results regarding the population. You said and you showed that in 90s, in those cities that lost the capital city function afterwards, we have an increase in population, while in these largest metropolitan centers, we observed a decrease. And this is because the suburbanization process has started. This process started first in metropolitan centers, and then afterwards only in these middle-sized cities. So this would be really worth to look not only at the city within its administrative border, but rather to look at the functional urban areas and to check how this changed. Because actually the suburbanization processes has been much more significant in the case of medium-sized cities. The share of population that they lost because of suburbanization was higher in larger metropolitan centers. That also partly might explain some results you obtained. So these are my doubts, and I appreciate your reaction.
Thank you very much. Adam.
Thank you for the presentation. I'd like to elaborate a bit on the parallel trend assumption. You devoted a lot of attention and a lot of time of your presentation to argue that you met this assumption, but frankly, I'm not convinced. Because parallel trend assumption is not about the period before the treatment, but about the period after the treatment. So it says something like that. If parallel trend assumption holds when in the absence of treatment, we can assume that the control and treatment group will behave in parallel. And there is no formal test for this because it could not be, because we do not know alternative reality. So please elaborate a bit, how can you argue that this parallel trend assumption holds in your case? So you presented those graphs where the trends before the treatment overlaps. But the problem is that on the left-hand side of the graph, so before the treatment, you have only 5 years. And on the right-hand side of the treatment point, you have 20 years. And in most of the graphs, the differences started to appear only after some years. It could be real effect, it could be not, but in the differences literature, it is argued that it is easier to argue that the parallel trend assumption holds for the smaller, for the shorter periods of times. So I'm wondering if you were just rerunning your analysis for a very short period of time, like 3 years before and 3 years after the treatment, how the situation will look like.
Thank you. Do we have other questions? I'll give the audience more time by asking my questions. I would like to return to this, to what Professor Smankowski said about the treatment group. To put it in another way, I agree with his remarks, but to put it another way, I think it's that this statement that the assignment to the treatment group was random is not very credible in this case. It's very difficult to prove that it's random to decide whether you keep your status of regional capital or not. Even in your introduction to your paper, you said that besides or population-related or economy-related determinants, there were some political decisions, like you said that President Kwaśniewski single-handedly decided. Well, the political support is not a random. It's not a random issue. It's not a random factor. So I think even if you don't see it in your in these probit models, because most of the variables there were insignificant. They may be insignificant because you have very little observations in this period. I'm not sure if it was 5 years or just 1 year you check, but it's also the selection of variables you use. I think it's very difficult to believe that this assignment is to the treatment group is random. What I would propose is that you try to run something similar to what you did with your robustness check. You run the analysis for the alternative placebo treatment group. I would recommend to try to do it for placebo control group, because I would argue that maybe the right control group for your research are not the cities that kept their status of capital regional capitals, but those who were cities of similar size who had never had the status of regional capital, but they were just similar cities, similar towns to those who lost the titles. Maybe if you conduct this analysis using cities losing the status of regional capital as your treatment group, and cities who did not lose the status because they never had it, but they are similar in terms of population and economic conditions. Maybe if you run this analysis, and this will be your control group, maybe you will see that the differences you observe are really the differences between the large cities and the medium-sized small cities in Poland in the next years, 20 years, and not between those holding or losing the status of regional capital. You may treat it as another robustness check also, but I think it will be valuable, and it will shed more light on what's really going on here. Okay, so that's my question suggestion. Do you have a question? Yes, we have a student on board.
Thank you for the presentation. And I have a question. Well, one of the leading questions that you presented was whether the transition was a real loss or a phantom pain. And I do believe that phantom pain is something not based on facts, it's rather something that is created due to the understanding of the situation. And I was thinking because I do believe that there has been also nowadays some switch in how we understand, like how some people understand the results of living in a metropolis, of living in big cities, and many people are trying to escape from all the negative aspects that are connected directly to living in big cities. And I was wondering whether those middle-sized or small cities are trying to somehow coin this phantom pain into something positive, into something that might be not directly connected with all those bad aspects that might be connected or linked in our minds. So also some sort of, I think, by people to living in those rather big cities, or is there like no sort of joint between those?
Thank you very much. Looking for questions. More other questions online? Do we have some? No. Okay, so let us hear the answers to the questions. I hope you found them helpful.
Yes. So, well, thank you very much for the remarks and for the questions. Well, I try to do justice to them and answer. So, in a kind of chronological order. So, first, the questions for Professor Szymanowski, if I recollect correctly, it was about the difference in development processes between the biggest and the medium-sized cities, that they are so qualitatively different, and that it's kind of obvious that we would have such results. And to elaborate more on the robustness checks. So, I agree that there is a growing discrepancy between the biggest and the smaller cities, and we are not claiming that we explain all of it, that all of the difference in development trajectories. We only explain part of it. For some, this part ranges from 20 to 48% of the difference in development. So the message is that the reform did contribute, but obviously it doesn't explain all that we observe. And for the robustness checks, we rerun those tests using the county cities, miasta na prawach powiatu, as our placebo control. And then we didn't see anything that would destabilize, so to speak, those findings. And regarding the population outflow, so we cannot really say much about the population. We can only say about the share of children and seniors, which can be linked to suburbanization. And I have to say that you are right in pointing out that the optimal design for this study would be to have functional areas, a picture, not the administrative areas. But unfortunately, we cannot do it with the data we have. But yeah, maybe this is a bit of a counter argument to the share of children and share of seniors. Then the question, Paula, would you like to take the question of Dr. Kłoszaj about the parallel trends assumption?
Yeah, I can take this up on the parallel trends assumption because it's where I work quite a bit on. So the argument was that we have different lengths in time period, and I absolutely agree to that. I mean, we also know that this is like a disadvantage of our study, especially because before we do not have the same amount of years. I mean, of course, we're happy that we have 20 years after, but ideally we would, of course, also have 20 years before, which simply is not feasible because of when the reforms happened and how and when statistics Poland started tracking. So we only have this years before. What is maybe good to clarify that the graphs that we show in the presentation, they are the linear trends, not the observed means. So if you look at the observed means, there is you see them overlapping, but they don't overlap in reality. So they are they are different. But the fact that they overlap in these graphs that we show is simply to see better, like visually see better if they overlap or not. But in reality, they are different. So think, thanks. Yeah, Borys, I think here you can really see like very well. So this is, for example, private entities per 1,000 dwellers. And on the left here, you see the observed mean. So this is what actually happens, that there's a difference between the control and treatment group. And then on the right, you see the linear trends model. So you simply start in 1995, you put both starting points like on top of each other, and then see how these two lines develop, simply to see better, easier if there's a parallel trend or not. But just to clarify this. And what we have then done, because we said, okay, we have 5 years before, and this is also the reason why we report afterwards different time periods, length afterwards, so 5, 10, and 20 years. And at least like the first one after 5 years, they more or less matches the time before. So you could argue that you have more or less the same time before and after. And we already see in the case of most variables that there is already a significant negative effect. Not in all, this is, I agree, like some really need more time to unfold. But at least, you know, a good amount of them, they already show a negative and significant effect already after 5 years. So really matching the pre-treatment time.
Okay, and so then the professor's Herbst questions about randomness of treatment assignment and about doing some placebo, different type of placebo checks. Well, you were perfectly right, because the treatment is not random, like the treatment is driven by population. That's why we control for it. And what is important in this specification is that it should be, let's say, random from the perspective of our outcome interest. So I would say it can be seen a bit as good as random, but definitely, yeah, the population was a factor, and that's why we control for it. But I really like your comment, and I think we should really dig more into it, is running the specification with different placebo control group. We did this at the very beginning, but at some time we stopped, but maybe we should come back to see how those cities fared compared to other similar cities, and repeat the specification. And for the political alignment, honestly, like when I was doing those checks in the beginning, and we did logit models, we did pool data for the entire pre-treatment period, we have seen it like sometimes being significant or not. Sometimes being significant. But then in the final specification, to my, it made me unhappy that it was not significant. But maybe for those small cities, you know, for these few selected cities, it played a role, but yet on the level of means at which we operate, it was just too little of an influence to be grasped by our specification. But we should definitely maybe run those models with different placebo control groups. Also play a bit with the placebo treatment assignment models, because that's what we didn't redo, yeah, so far. So thank you very much. And there was the last question from the students back in the room, and I think I didn't hear it correctly. So if you could clarify whether the small cities have some positive aspects that they can leverage for their local development, or to make people stay in the smaller and medium-sized cities. Is that correct?
Well, what I meant precisely was that basically, as I understood it, the fund campaign is something that is rather something that you understand. It wasn't mainly based in facts, rather on this hard pride of not being a regional capital anymore. So I was thinking, if nowadays with changing trends, there might have been some change also within the results that you were testifying, to see if there is some switch also in the soft side, so like the understanding of the situation, and is there like any possibility that those cities can actually benefit from not being the capital city of their region anymore?
So whether they can see any benefit in not being a capital region, I bet that they would. They would be probably happy to be the regional capital. But but it's a very good question. And to be honest, the phantom pain is real in a way, you know, because if people feel bad about their city and they attribute for example, some problems in their cities to this narrative of not being a capital city, it may have real consequences. But this, I would say, should be subjected to different type of analysis, more of a, probably Foucauldian discourse analysis of how cities are perceived and how we construct different narratives about cities. So this could be interesting, and whether we see any retreat, like any movement back to smaller cities, or their kind of recovery. I don't really know. I cannot, I think, speak in such general terms now. On the one hand, you have this repetitive narrative about the crisis cities. So the cities which are losing their metropolitan functions, the list of 122 cities. Created by PAN, Polish Academy of Sciences. So from the broad picture, it seems bleak, but I don't know. I don't really know. I live now in a very small city in Italy, and actually I moved to a very small city because I'm interested in peripheries and how this city was destroyed by an earthquake, and there's a very strong kind of movement to rebuild it, and I'm trying to understand what makes people stay in such a city and not move to Rome, but I don't know yet. So I'm really sorry, I cannot answer your question.
Thank you very much. If there are no more questions, then I would like to close our seminar. It was a very good presentations and nice discussion. I hope we were able to help you a bit.
Yes, you were.
So please welcome, join us for another seminars if you can. Yeah.
Of course, we invite everyone for the next week. Professor Mironowicz from Polytechnic of Gdańsk will be saying about transformation of residential areas in Central Europe in Polish. Yes, so
I can join.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, and have a good afternoon then.
Thank you also from my side.